All right, and so moving right along here in Beowulf. So we have the building of the Hall of Heorot and its naming as a place of light. He kept his promise, gave presents of rings and treasure at the feasting, like a good king should reward. Notice the flows are going here, treasures flowing. Um, the hall towered high, lofty and wide-gabled. Fierce tongues of loathsome fire had not yet attacked it, nor was the time yet near when a mortal feud should flare between father and son-in-law, sparked off by deeds of deadly enmity. And so, as the audience would have known, beyond the events of the narrative here, Heorot will be burned to the ground by the Heathobards, led by Ingeld, who the father-in-law and the father and the son-in-law are Hrothgar's the father, and the son-in-law is Ingeld, who has married Hrothgar's daughter, Freya married her, but in an attempt to stop this kind of thing from happening. But it does happen, and Ingeld has heard an insult from the Danes that somehow has been passed to him, and he goes to war, and the place is burned down. And so it's in its beginning, its very construction is already pregnant with its ending by death by fire, just as in Ragnarok, the universe will end by fire when the god Surt, S-U-R-T, shows up with a brand and sets it on fire. And so note that Ingeld, in a way, is a kind of euhemerized or secularized human equivalent of the god Surt, who will come to bring the torch to burn Heorot down. So the place is doomed, just as the dynasty is doomed, which after Hrothgar's death will tear itself apart as his nephew Hrothulf murders Hrothgar's son Hrethric and takes over the throne, who will then be murdered by his cousin Hereward. Then the brutish demon who lived in darkness. Now note that with the immediate introduction of Grendel, he's immediately associated with the realm of darkness. And so we're to imagine here Heorot is the realm of light in opposition mythologically to the realm of darkness that is in opposition to it, and which has set up a kind of difference engine by way of which the cosmos runs, just as the same thing in Scandinavian myth takes place when from out of the Ginnunga Gap, the earth self-organizes between the region of ice in the north, the realm of Rime and ice, R-I-M-E, Rime and ice in the north, and in the south the region of Muspel, which they associated with heat, the hot, sunny Mediterranean perhaps. And the world exists out of a gap, the Ginnunga Gap, that comes into being between ice and fire. In a similar way here, Heorot is built as a realm of light that is separated from darkness, and now a being from that realm of darkness is going to emerge into the realm of light and squash it out. So then the brutish demon who lived in darkness impatiently endured a time of frustration. Day after day he heard the din of merrymaking inside the hall and the sound of the harp and the bard's clear song. He who could tell of the origin of men from far-off times lifted his voice, saying that the Almighty made the earth, this radiant plain encompassed by oceans, and that God all-powerful ordained sun and moon to shine for mankind, adorned all regions of the world with trees and leaves, and saying that he gave life to every kind of creature that walks about earth. Notice that the shop, S-C-O-P, the shop, note the pun there, by the way, that Joyce in Finnegan's Wake calls Shakespeare shopkeeper as an allusion to the keeper of the stories in Old English, who would have been called the shop, pronounced the shop. The shopkeeper, Shakespeare is the keeper of the tales. The shop here is basically reciting God's creation of the universe as a sort of mirror image to Hrothgar's creation of Heorot as a cosmos that is opening up a clearing, a Lichtung, in Heidegger's sense of a clearing, a space of encounter between entities, in which entities can unconceal themselves from out of the darkness and make their nature evident. So God creates the world, and this may be an echo. It sounds a little like Cadman's hymn that Beda quotes, which is the oldest known English poem, Cadman's hymn. In Beda's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, he quotes it. It sounds a little like that hymn, but it also reminds me of Genesis A, which is an Old English text, one of the few texts perhaps that's older than Beowulf, and that the Beowulf poet seems to have been familiar with here. And so it's not so much the sounds of the merrymaking and the partying, I think, that disturbs Grendel, so much as it's the resentment of recounting the myth of the book of Genesis of God's creation of the universe the separation out of light from darkness, the creation of the planets, which is also, with the world set with trees and leaves, is supposed to remind the Scandinavian of his old mythology of the cosmic tree Yggdrasil, that the universe is situated in the cosmic tree. Yggdrasil is the pole star, the axis around which everything pivots, and which connects the upper world, where Valhalla is situated at the other end of the rainbow bridge, Bifrost, in opposition to the realm of Hell down below, Hel, down below, which is the underworld, a dark, boggy, swamp-like place that very much resembles the mere or the swamp that Grendel and his mother live in, and from which he has come out of. So the Beowulf poet wants you to think of the Scandinavian conception of Hel, Hel, from which we get our word Hell, Hell, but not the Scandinavian conception of Hell. We've inherited the Mediterranean conception of Hell as a place of fire. The Scandinavian conception of Hell is much closer to Grendel's swamp. It's a boggy, dark, miserable place, and it's governed by a goddess named Hel, Hel, who is an offspring of Loki, the mischief god. This gruesome creature was called Grendel. Grendel in Old English would mean, perhaps it means Grindan in Old English, which means to grind, or in Old Norse, the name for a storm is Grendel. So either way, whether he's named after a storm or named after a grinding force, storms grind things down. So he's a force of nature that has blown its way into Heorot and intends to grind it down. This gruesome creature was called Grendel, notorious prowler of the borderland, ranger of the moors, the fen, and the fastness. This cursed creature lived in a monster's lair for a time after the Creator had condemned him as one of the seed of Cain. The everlasting Lord avenged Abel's murder. Cain had no satisfaction from that feud, but the Creator sent him into exile, far from mankind, because of his crime. Note the comparison with Satan's rebellion that's recounted in the Old English text, Genesis A, with Satan's rebellion against God, but also the fact of Cain slaying his brother Abel. Fratricide was one of the primary crimes in Scandinavian society. It was one of the primary crimes. And we'll see that a few people are guilty of it. The character known as Unferth is guilty of it. And eventually, fratricidal strife is the force that will tear apart the Danish royal house of the Schildings. He could no longer approach the throne of grace, that precious place in God's presence, nor did he feel God's love. In him all evildoers find their origin, monsters and elves and spiteful spirits of the dead, also the giants who grappled with God for a long while. The Lord gave them their deserts. The poet wants you to think both of the giants out of Scandinavian mythology. Scandinavian mythology is full of giants, and indeed they're part of the creation myth. Ymir is the cosmic giant from out of which the gods crystallize and just condense. But he also wants you to think of the giants in Christian myth in the Old Testament from Genesis 4, I think it is, or is it Genesis 6? Maybe it's Genesis 6, where the giants are the offspring of angels who have come down to mate with the sons of men and produce the Nephilim. The Nephilim are these giants who then somehow survive the flood and are the reason, in some of the apocryphal accounts, they are the reason for why, because they're an abomination, this mixture of the human and the divine, for why God decides to destroy man with the flood because of the giants. But Grendel has survived here as a giant with his mother. Perhaps certain giants have survived the flood by living in boggy, flood-like places. Then, under cover of night, Grendel came to Hrothgar's lofty hall to see how the Ringdanes were disposed after drinking ale all evening, and he found there a band of brave warriors, well feasted, fast asleep, dead to worldly sorrow, man's sad destiny. At once that hellish monster, grim and greedy, brutally cruel, started forward and seized 30 Thanes, even as they slept. Beowulf will come across the water as a party of 15, himself included. I think these numbers are suspect as numbers that are associated with the moon. The moon has a 30-day cycle, average 30-day cycle, half of which would be 15. I think there's a possible reference to the moon. And then, gloating over his plunder, he hurried from the hall, made for his lair with all those slain warriors. So he shows up and simply grabs 30 men and takes them back to his lair and eats them up. So he's a cannibal. Then at dawn, as day first broke, Grendel's power was at once revealed. A great lament was lifted after the feast, an anguished cry at that daylight discovery. The famous prince, best of all men, sat apart in mourning, When he saw Grendel's gruesome footprints, that great man grieved for his retainers. This enmity was utterly one-sided, too repulsive, too long-lasting, nor were the Danes allowed respite. But the very next day Grendel committed violent assault, murders more atrocious than before, and he had no qualms about it. He was caught up in his crimes. Then it was not difficult to find the man who preferred a more distant resting place, a bed in the outbuildings, for the hatred of the hall warden was quite unmistakable. He who had escaped the clutches of the fiend kept further off, at a safe distance. So there's been a failure here of the immune system of Heorot. And I think what we'll find throughout the text is that there's been a failure on the part of the ruling classes, the sovereigns, the kings. A number of them have failed in a number of contexts. And as the scholar Georges Dumézil remarked, of Indo-Aryan society, it has a tripartite structure, and this is true from Germany to India, a tripartite structure of the ruling classes, the sovereigns, and in Scandinavian myth that would be Wotan and Tyr, and they're very often paired in twos, as Mitra and Varuna are in Indian myth. One is a sort of good god, friendly to men, and the other is a sort of dark punisher who's not friendly to men. But Wotan and Tyr, after whom Tuesday and Wednesday are named, form a pair. Then Thor would correspond to the middle class, which is the warrior elite that enforces the sovereign class. Thor is in the middle there, just as Indra is in Indian myth, is in the middle class. And then, just as in Indian myth, the final estate, which is that of fecundity associated with agriculture and the soil and farming, is the god Freyr in Germanic myth, and the Ashvins, who are the twins who correspond to the Gemini in Indian myth. And so what we'll see is that there's been a general failure throughout Beowulf of the sovereign classes. They have failed in their task of getting the treasure to flow. And so there's a wasteland situation that requires the middle classes, the warrior elite, to intervene. And so Beowulf is sent in to intervene and get the treasure flowing again by slaying Grendel, just as Indra has to slay the dragon Vritra, who has gobbled up all the waters. In order to get the waters to flow again, he has to shoot a thunderbolt at him and slay him. So that's Beowulf's task as a member of the warrior elite. Thus Grendel ruled, resisted justice, won against all, until the best of halls stood deserted, and so it remained. For 12 long winters, the Lord of the Danes was sorely afflicted with sorrows and cares. So this goes on for 12 years, and note that 12 years is a Jupiter cycle. Jupiter, the planet Jupiter, takes 12 years to go around the sun, which may or may not be intentional on the poet's part. But if it is, it's interesting because that cycle was associated in India anyway with the killing of kings, with ritual regicide every 12 years, which was timed with the planet Jupiter. But it may also simply be timed that way so that the poet can give Ingeld, the son of Frodo, who was king of the Heathobards that Hrothgar slew, time to grow up and come to maturity. He's probably 5 or 6 years old at the time the narrative opens up. 12 years later, he's about 20 years old, and he's ready to march the Heathobards, to lead the Heathobards in war against the Danes 12 years later. A couple of years after Beowulf rids them of Grendel is when that battle takes place. Then men were reminded in mournful songs that the monster Grendel fought with Hrothgar for a long time, fought with fierce hatred, committing crime and atrocity day after day in continual strife. He had no wish for peace with any of the Danes, would not desist from his daily malice or pay weregild. No, none of the counselors could hold out hope of handsome compensation at that slayer's hands. But the cruel monster constantly terrified young and old. The dark death shadow lurked in ambush. He prowled the misty moors at the dead of the night. Men do not know where such hell whisperers shrive in their wanderings. Such were the many and outrageous injuries that the fearful solitary foe of all men endlessly inflicted. He occupied Heorot, that hall adorned with treasures on cloudless nights. And so he's in the role of the dragon that hoards treasure, as the dragon at the end of the narrative will do. And this caused the Lord of the Danes deep heartbreaking grief. Strong men often sat in consultation, trying in vain to devise a good plan as to how best valiant men could safeguard themselves against sudden attack. And so we'll stop there for now.